I'm delighted to say I'm now joined by Labour MP Nick Thomas-Symonds. Nick, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. I'd like to talk to you about Rwanda, if I could. We just heard in the last half an hour, Operation Vector is the name of the government's new crackdown. 800 immigration officers involved across the country, chasing down 5,700 people currently on bail. Will it work, or is it too little, too late? More to the point, is it performative on the eve of elections?
Well, Martin, first of all, it's very good to join you as always. I've always feared that this Rwanda policy is a gimmick, and it's a pretty expensive gimmick at that, frankly. I mean, there's hundreds of millions of pounds that have already been spent on this scheme. And if you look at experience, Israel, for example, had a similar deal with Rwanda that it terminated in 2018 because it wasn't working. And that is my real fear around this. Now, of course, we have to tackle this issue of small boats in the English Channel. We really have to do that. But this gimmick, this sort of headline-grabbing way, if you like, of trying to do it, is no substitute for the very hard work that has to be done to crack down on the criminal smuggler gangs.
But you would agree, wouldn't you, that illegal immigration is completely and utterly out of control, Nick? What the Labour Party are going to do? I mean, you talked about having more staff to process them. That's basically what the Conservative Party has just proposed. Cracking down on gangs sounds great, but nobody's managed to achieve that so far. One interesting thing you did talk about, though, Nick Thomas-Symonds, was the idea of pairing with a third country to process. And countries that were mentioned included Greece and Turkey. Is that something that the Labour Party has got up its sleeve?
No, our plan is in a number of steps. So first of all, we do want to work internationally to break the model of the criminal smuggler gangs. People do not become refugees in northern France. They've usually travelled very long journeys. Now, what we are saying is that the money that's being allocated to the Rwanda scheme, we will instead spend to create a new unit within the National Crime Agency that will work closely with international partners, not just France, but Belgium, far further afield as well. Also work closely with Europol and go back to a situation where we can share data in real time and actually influence those investigations across the channel. Second, here, we've got to get a better grip of the asylum system. If you go back to 2014, over 80% of cases then were being dealt with within 6 months. And people were being housed in the accommodation that we've historically used. Instead now we have a backlog way over 100,000 with people in hotels, miserable existence for them, and you're talking £6-7 million a day to the taxpayer, which is totally unacceptable. Thirdly, we need to get returns agreements in place. We'd create a returns unit in the Home Office dedicated to doing that, so that when people are not entitled to be here, they can then be removed. That is a fair system that Labour would look to create, both for the people in the system and for the British taxpayer.
Nick, would that returns agreement involve some kind of deal with the European Union member states? Because these people are coming from France. We should be sending them back to France. That's where they came from, a safe country. That's what millions of people think. But any form of deal with France, Macron has said, well, you'd have to go to Brussels. Is Sir Keir Starmer going to do a closer deal with the European Union to sort this out? Because that would mean a reciprocal deal where we are duty-bound to accept huge numbers across the 27 member states.
No. Well, in terms of of course there is important bilateral work with France, first of all. Our law enforcement agencies working very closely with French law enforcement is a really important aspect of policing the situation in the Channel.
But so that hasn't worked so far,
really
Nick.
Important, Martin.
That hasn't worked. We spent £500 million a year. It hasn't worked.
Well, in terms of the numbers crossing the channel, Martin, you're entirely correct in terms of the thousands that are still coming. Doesn't mean, of course, that both our law enforcement and indeed French law enforcement are not stopping even greater numbers. But I agree that the fact that the numbers are continuing as they are shows that you need a more strategic approach in relation to a returns agreement and the European Union. To suggest somehow we'd be taking tens of thousands of people is just frankly utter garbage. If you look at the situation that we had previously, it was called the Dublin III regulation, and what it meant was that we had the right to return people to other safe countries, and there was a very limited family reunion safe route. But that is just one aspect of this. We need to be looking at this both at source, busting the criminal smuggler gangs. We need to be looking at the chaos in the Home Office the Conservatives have created, and then the returns agreements as well. So it's a systematic approach. It isn't going to be something that one lever can simply solve.
OK, Nick, I want to talk to you about knife crime. We have a terrible, terrible, tragic problem with knife crime right across the United Kingdom. We saw in West Streeting's constituency yesterday, now tragically named 14-year-old boy was brutally killed. We saw an incident today in Sheffield in a school, the attempted murder of 3 there. We saw in Wales a couple of weeks ago. We've got a terrible problem with knife crime. If the Labour Party was to get into power, what on earth are you going to do to stamp out this cancer?
Well, look, firstly, I think we'd all be thinking about the families who've been involved in all 3 incidents that you've mentioned, terrible incidents here in London, in Sheffield, and indeed back in Ammanford in my native Wales. And credit as well, Martin, because I've been on your show previously, I think, debating about the police. Great credit as well for the bravery that our first responders have showed in those 3 situations. Now, I also think that we have to be looking again at a number of different things. Firstly, we frankly need more police officers, and the next Labour government, if we are privileged enough to form one, will recruit 13,000 more police officers, and we will do that by pooling resources of all the police forces across England and Wales. Well, currently they are separately procuring cars, procuring uniforms and other things. Let's bring that together and use that money, that £360 million, to recruit more frontline officers. But we also need, with regard to knife crime, I think we've been at various stages of banning particular designs of knives since 2016. We need to look again at that to make sure that we are capturing the kind of knives that firstly we don't want on our streets, but we don't want traded online either. So these are crucial things that we need to be doing so that people do feel once again safe on our streets. And you'll know, Martin, that Keir Starmer's spoken about his 5 missions for the next Labour government. Tackling crime, halving violent crime is absolutely one of those missions and central to making people feel safe on our streets.
OK, Nick Thomas-Symonds, thank you as ever for joining us here on GB News. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.